Okay. Hello to everybody. I hope you are all keeping safe and well in the current uncertain time. I am Kamiri Tafak, Financial Sector Advisor within the Secretariat of Making Finance Work for Africa. And today I will essentially officiate as facilitator of this webinar. It is indeed my pleasure and honor to welcome you on behalf of Making Finance Work for Africa and our partner ECO Business Fund, ECO Development Fund, and the United Nations Environment Program for Finance Initiative, UNEP-FI. We are pleased to welcome you to this webinar on the topic of bank as agent for biodiversity. There is an urgent need to sensitize financial institutions on the nexus between finance and biodiversity. The webinar will uncover the role of banks in the global biodiversity crisis, and so that they can incorporate the best principle into their processes to help sustaining ecosystems as well as harness ensuing opportunity. Today, we have a set of distinguished speakers from UNEP-FI, the Natural Capital Finance Alliance, Finance is Motions, and the Green Digital Finance Alliance. Before we delve into the topic of today, and as the program appears on the screen, next please, I will share with you that's the program of this session. So I will share with you some practical information about the webinar. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, so in terms of housekeeping issue, you need to know, housekeeping point, you need to know that the webinar of today will last for about 1 hour and a half, including Q&A. And to ensure a high quality of this experience, all participants will be muted. The question can be submitted via the chat box and the Q&A, but we really prefer if you can use the Q&A box. For live questions, you can raise your hand. The slide and the recording of this webinar will be shared within 72 hours, and they will also be available on our website, www.mfw.org. If you have any issue, technical issue, do not hesitate to send a message to the organizer. And finally, at the end of the session, you will have a questionnaire that will pop up. Please, we will be very pleased if you can really fill in these questionnaires, and so that will help us to improve the quality of our webinar going forward. Next slide. Allow me to share a few highlights on Making Finance Work for Africa with you before we move into the substance of this webinar. Making Finance Work for Africa is a G8 initiative launched in October 2007. The secretary of this initiative is hosted by the African Development Bank. It is actually a platform for the harmonization and facilitation of financial sector development and knowledge sharing on the continent. We bring together the donor partner, African development, governments, private sectors, and other financial sector stakeholders with the aim of unleashing the potential of African financial sector. The ultimate goals being to improve economic development, to accelerate economic development and reduce poverty on the continent. To do this work, we benefit from the support of a number of institutional partners. Essentially, we have the African Development Bank, the German corporations, French corporation, the BIEs, BI, which is the the EIB, which is the European Investment Bank, the EU, the Afrexim banks, and the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We work along a number of strategic pillars, which are financial inclusions, long-term finance, and financial stability and governance. And our work essentially focuses on knowledge management, advocacy, and networking. Before I hand over to Jessica, Mrs. Jessica Smith, who is officiated as the moderator of this webinar, I will first of all pass the floor to Mr. Eric Wayama for a quick introduction on the Eco Business Fund, and Finance in Motions. Eric is a senior officer. Officer at the Eco Business Fund. So Eric, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hughes. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. My name is Eric Wanyama. I'm Senior Officer in charge of Technical Assistance with Finance in Motion, specifically for the Eco Business Fund. Next slide. Next slide, please. So Finance in Motion is an impact asset manager, currently with over $2.5 billion in assets under management spread across 6 funds that traverse the developing world. Next slide. Within Sub-Saharan Africa, it advises the Eco Business Fund, which was initiated in 2019 with a mission to promote biodiversity conservation, sustainable use of natural resources, and climate change adaptation and mitigation within the agriculture, forestry, aquaculture, and tourism sectors. Next slide, please. It pursues its mission through investments, through direct and indirect investments in corporates and financial institutions in the 4 sectors that I just mentioned. And it also has a complementary technical assistance facility that provides capacity building support to investees, as well as works with sector stakeholders to try and create a more enabling environment for mainstream sustainable practices. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Eric, for this very quick highlight on the Eco Business Fund and Finance's motions. On that note, I will introduce our moderator of today, Mrs. Jessica Smith, as I said. But very quickly, I will say Jessica is the ecosystem lead at UNEP FI. She has worked extensively to mobilize and evaluate environment finance globally and across Africa. She is clearly an expert, a renowned expert in this field. For the past 7 years, she has directed consultancy firms undertaking environment finance project development and evaluation, and leading secretary for the Ecuador Principal Associations, as well as she supported the cross-sector biodiversity initiative. So Jessica is really the person that we wanted for this webinar. Thank you very much, Jessica, for agreeing to moderate these sessions. I will now hand over the floor to you for the next hour and 15 minutes. You have the floor.
Great, thank you, Hughes, for the generous introduction, and to both of you and Eric for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. So at the UNEP Finance Initiative, we work with banks, insurers, and investors through different platforms like the Principles for Responsible Banking, the Principles for Responsible Investment. We have a leadership platform with them, and Principles for Sustainable Insurance. And within the ecosystems theme, we have a number of initiatives around moving private financial flows towards sustainable development. So the Natural Capital Finance Alliance, we're part of the group setting up the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure. And we have thematic work around the sustainable blue economy, or oceans, and sustainable food systems today. Personally, I've spent many of the last 17 years of my career working based in Africa, working around the various parts of Africa, or collaborating with African partners. So I was really excited about this topic. And I think banks are a really important agent for change, particularly when we think about small and medium-sized enterprises and the opportunities around biodiversity-based enterprises. So I think there's a great synergy here on this theme. I noticed a lot of the participants come from a finance background, banking, investment, and business development. So I just wanted to introduce a little bit more about, what is biodiversity and why is the African continent so important and exciting on this topic. So there's a lot of different ways to define biodiversity, and our first presenter, Thomas, is going to, delve a little bit deeper into that. But there are different ways to look at biodiversity. So just showing on the map of key biodiversity areas for the world, which is on the right, Africa has many of the terrestrial and marine biodiversity areas that are considered most important in the world, and also many of the important biodiversity hotspots, which have a lot of endemic species, not seen anywhere else in the world. So it's very important from that perspective. And also, we all know it's such a huge continent. It also contains a number of different ecosystems and ecoregions, which are very varied and unique, and they provide different human services and services to our societies and economy, as well as the environmental services. So biodiversity is vast. Biodiversity is all around us. And, just on the next slide, I highlighted some of the biodiversity that, is familiar to me. But just to narrow it down, we're talking about genes, habitats, and species. And we often talk about natural capital as being the value that we generate from those biodiversity components. And I think Thomas will also talk a little bit about ecosystem services and how that relates. So, as the African continent is so full of biodiversity and actually contains many of the biodiversity leaders, some of the banks around Africa like EcoBank, Nedbank, Standard Bank are really leaders in the biodiversity space. So it's a wonderful peer-to-peer exchange possible around the various regions. Today, we're going to talk about biodiversity as a compliance issue and the international norms a little bit. Look at the risks around biodiversity, and Thomas will delve into that. And then also the opportunities, the financial and development opportunities around biodiversity. And Federico and Marianne are going to delve a little bit more on that exciting angle. So many people working in sustainable finance are more familiar with climate change issues than biodiversity. And one thing to really note, the difference between climate and biodiversity is very localized. And it is an important angle to think about. How do we manage these resources that are really fixed, to some degree by location, as opposed to the climate where emissions are global. From a compliance angle, there are international norms evolving around how financing relates to biodiversity and what are particularly the safeguards around biodiversity that are expected. From an international perspective, the IFC Performance Standard number 6 on biodiversity is very important and influential, and many commercial banks around Africa have signed up to the Equator Principles to implement those performance standards. There is a tendency that it is cheaper and easier to access finance where those international norms are adhered to. So that's a kind of a business case for thinking of it from that angle. And then there are domestic laws and regulations that also need to be adhered to in various countries. From the risk identification and management and mitigation angle, many of the biodiversity risks are similar to climate change. And Thomas will go into those a little bit more. From the opportunities, there are so many opportunities around using biodiversity as a development asset and thinking about the financial inclusion opportunities, because biodiversity is mainly in rural areas. And there are often vulnerable livelihoods or unexploited livelihood opportunities to improve people's well-being in those rural areas, which offers important strategies. For example, when we're trying to recover from the setbacks of COVID-19. Worldwide, the World Economic Forum estimates that there's 10 trillion in annual business value and 395 million jobs possible building on biodiversity by 2030. So there's no specific estimate for Africa, but at least a slice of that is very enticing. There's also a lot of opportunities around sovereign lending and new proposals around nature-based sovereign bonds. So tying the incentives around sovereign lending to environmental performance. And then from an infrastructure development perspective, we rely on ecosystem services like water, and natural capital can provide us with strategies for ecosystem infrastructure that helps us to deliver those services. So we have three fantastic presenters today. Thomas van Wegen will talk about embedding natural capital into financial decision-making processes. Federico Sinistra will talk about making biodiversity bankable. And Marianne Haar will talk about fintech's role in enabling banks to design nature positive practices. So I'm looking forward to this session and our Q&A afterwards. And I will go ahead and move on to introduce Thomas. So Thomas and I work together. He is the Natural Capital Finance Alliance South Africa project leader for the Encore tool. So that's exploring natural capital risks, opportunities, and exposure. And he's based in South Africa and describes himself as an evangelist for nature and a green business pundit. So Thomas works really at the interface of complex business, the environmental and social systems, and trying to embed a deeper understanding of the multiplicity and transboundary nature of emerging sustainability risk. So Thomas, I'll hand over to you to tell us a little bit about the work of the NCFA and the Encore tool.
Thanks very much, Jessica, and good afternoon or good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and looking forward to this the session with you this afternoon. Next slide, please. Next slide. So the environmentalist Tom Burke said that the viral disruption which we've experienced over this last year was a sudden and visible shock, that commanded and got an immediate response. However, if you look at this picture and the graphics there, climate change is one of those stealth disruptors. Its impact on our lives are remorselessly, I would say, more incremental than the virus, and all the more dangerous for that. So the reality of climate change is no longer disputed. We see it all around of us, the loss of coral reefs, widespread flooding, uncontrollable wildfires, etc. So climate change can therefore be considered as a threat multiplier within the financial institutions, and similarly exacerbates conflict. And I think we are busy dangerously reaching a global tipping point with regards to that. Next slide, please. So this is one of my very favorite cartoons, and it's also a bit of an illustration of some of the biodiversity which is close to me and which I can experience quite regularly, coming from a South African context and African context. But biodiversity can really be seen as that elephant in the room, literally and figuratively. So we've had decades of focus on climate change and climate change impacts, but with very little regard for the impending natural capital disasters and biodiversity disasters that we're busy experiencing. Next page, slide, please. So climate change has largely been the primary consideration, like I said, for most businesses and financial institutions to date. And this is further underpinned by the various global reporting requirements. So we're all very familiar with things such as the carbon footprinting and carbon credit initiatives, United Nations Global Compact. All the world banks need to adhere to those, and the emerging principles for responsible investing and the principles for responsible banking, thanks to Jessica and our colleagues at the UNEP-FI, and then the emerging task force on climate disclosure, the TCFDs, which is currently, I would say, dominating the focus of financial institutions. And this is obviously leading to a lot of other initiatives which we've seen emerge over the last couple of years, and starting, however, for that fact in Africa, which is actually quite heartening to see some of the current records coming out. And I think, Jessica, you posted something recently on LinkedIn with regards to a Zambian green bond being established and implemented. So the green bond principles and those initiatives taking place. And then obviously a very strong drive that we've seen globally is this decarbonization of investment portfolios, amongst others, getting rid of coal or so-called dirty energy out of your investment portfolios. However, I must state that our society has failed to adequately recognize our dependency actually on nature and natural capital for that matter, and the interconnected relationship of these aspects are poorly understood and known as well. And next slide, please. So coming back to this connection with nature, and as we all know, the possible emergence of these SARS-CoV-like viruses out of nature and out of putting nature under stress, Vincent Cheng and his colleagues at one of the research institutes as early as 2007 already had identified that the presence of large reservoirs of SARS-CoV-like viruses in horseshoe bats, together with the culture of eating exotic mammals in southern China, is just a ticking time bomb. And the possibility of a reemergence of SARS and other novel viruses from animals or laboratories, and therefore the need for preparedness, should not be ignored. And although it took, 13 years for the COVID-19 pandemic to manifest and wreak havoc across the globe in a very short space of time, I must say, the correlation with the destruction of nature and the immense stress which we as a species are placing on the other so-called lesser species of the planet has resulted in an emergence of another global pandemic post-SARS, and obviously that's COVID-19. And what we're seeing is potentially that this new normal that we're entering into is going to be something which is going to be recurring. So I often like to refer to it as the Pandora's box. We've literally opened the Pandora's box and we do not know what to expect in future years coming. So taking biodiversity and natural capital into consideration in every single type of decision-making process that we're involved in is critical for us to get an understanding of how we're going to future-proof businesses and the financial institutions going forward. Next slide, please. So we're all asking ourselves, and I think, I personally can attest to it, and I'm sure every single person on this panel today and in the audience can attest to us asking these questions throughout 2020 and even into 2021, the uncertainty that we went into this year with, this great what now? And the famous economist Milton Friedman said that only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When a crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. So this is certainly a time of uncertainty. However, I think we've got to contemplate what this new future will look like, and the regime that we're busy, and this new regime that we've actually been put into, because we basically have gone through a somewhat other kind of tipping point over the last year. And of one thing we are certain is that we cannot go back to business as usual as the way we were. Next slide, please. So decisions for post-COVID world. I mean, there's currently a lot of debate around the reimagining of this new social and environmental and ecological regime, and what this is going to look like, and what the opportunities amidst this crisis that are starting to emerge. And we're already seeing a lot of these types of initiatives. The UN initiative of #Build Back Better. There's a new deal for nature, and the significant traction that's been taken in Europe with the EU taxonomy around natural capital and biodiversity, greater social inclusion, and the numerous green economic stimulus packages that I've also referred to previously, all to transition the world, albeit to a sustainable and a green future and a social trajectory. Next slide, please. Thanks. Next slide. Thanks. So, so coming back to this aspect of, let's get a bit into the technical stuff of what is natural capital? So natural capital can be defined, and within the Encore, the work that we're doing, our definition is a stock of environmental assets, which includes biophysical elements such as water, species, clean air, etc., and the physical elements which makes up the inert components of our biosphere, such as minerals, geomorphology, and the sediments which underpin the formation of ecosystem services. Next slide, please. So looking at natural capital further in Encore, it's a way of thinking about nature as a stock, if you have to put it in some kind of economic and financial terms, that produces a flow of benefits to people and the economy. And as illustrated in the previous slides, it contains, things such as natural capital, as what we have here, water, forest, clean air, etc., and then describes the goods and services that natural capital provides, such as food and fiber, water, climate regulation, etc., amongst other things. And those are called ecosystem services. And you can go and have a look at detail in terms of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment that was done a couple of years ago. And some of these types of services include provisioning services, which is a supply of food, fuel, fiber, and timber, things like that. regulating services, pollination, water purification, climate regulation, etc., cultural services, and support services, amongst others. Thank you. Next slide. So looking at how this impacts on the financial system. So what we look at, we call it the dependency of natural capital from the economy on natural capital. So any adverse changes in natural capital will have a potential negative effect on the businesses that depend on it. And this figure above shows the dependencies of the economy on natural capital and the impacts such as pollution and waste in reducing that flow of goods and services to the economy. Next slide, please. I quite like this model because we're ultimately trying to bring everything back to the SDGs. And this just fundamentally explains the fact that the biosphere, and as I said, you know, in previous slides, which makes up natural capital assets, ecosystem services, biodiversity, completely underpins everything else that we experience on Earth. So economic activity is fundamentally entrenched and dependent on natural capital and biodiversity, and also healthy societies, and the prospering of societies also completely dependent on the health of those ecosystems. Thank you. Next slide. I'm just going to glance through the next slide, please. Some of the risks and how we perceive risk. We all know about the World Economic Forum Global Risk Series. The next slide, please. And what we've seen evolving over the 2007 up to date is an increase of the prominence of natural capital / environmental climate change related impacts taking place. And for the very first time in 2020, we had the top 5 risks and the top 10 risks with regard to likelihood and impact were all natural capital or climate change related risks to business. Next slide, please. So a report that came out from the World Economic Forum in the course of last year just contextualizes the contribution of natural capital to the world economy. And that figure came out to a 44 trillion that it contributes to the global GDP. So really not something to scoff at, and very fundamental figures those, and some of this information that has come out with regards to these type of figures have all come out of the Encore platform as well, which we're quite proud of. Next slide, please. One of the fundamental aspects which we need to take into consideration is interconnectedness of risks, and you can go and read up on this in the World Economic Forum's reports. And this just illustrates that all the risks are fundamentally interconnected with one another. So climate change action will, or delay or failure for climate change action will result in things such as involuntary migration, global governance failures, etc. Next slide, please. And this, the IP-based Global Assessment Report of 2019 similarly provides some stark information with regards to the decline in ecosystems and biodiversity. I'm not going to go into any of this in detail, but there's a clear illustration of this declining trend, which we really need to take very serious, and as well with regards to the impending mass extinction of species. Next slide, please. Next slide. Looking at why natural capital is important, and I'm just going to gloss through these because I've alluded to them before. You'll have environmental change, which then obviously impacts on your natural capital and then breaks a dependency relationship with the economy. And that is where the risk is for financial institutions and businesses alike. Next slide, please. And this just provides a little bit more detail. So if you had a drought impact, you've got reduced rainfall or water availability. You don't have water availability to irrigate your crops. And that then once again translates into a non-performing loan. If you're in the banking sector and you lend to an agricultural sector, that is where your risk lies. And these are all natural capital risks and biodiversity related risks. Next slide, please. Just looking at some of these aspects and how they relate to your business directly. As you can see, these are the ecosystem services, provision of materials, processes, inputs, etc. And if you go down to the next slide, please, you'll see the economic contribution of what happens when that relationship gets disrupted. And just taking materials, for instance, so Unilever's margins on a frozen food plummeted by 30% due to an inability to supply codfish in their value chain. So these become quite significant if you're lending money to Unilever and you're expecting a good, solid, sustainable return. Next slide, please. Next slide. Thanks. I'm not going to go into these in any detail. I'm sure they will be sharing the slides as well, the participants, but the next two slides just goes into a lot more detail with regards to that type of relationship in the cost of managed pollination, with specifically in California. In a nutshell, it is a ecosystem service that used to be provided for free by nature, which now has been disrupted, and now which costs an individual farmer up to $1 million to bring in managed beehives every single year to pollinate almond orchards. So quite a significant outlay, which is now got to be put in against the price of almonds. Next slide, please. And how does disruption risk affect your financial institutions? As you can see, environmental risk, it is right across your operations and your portfolios. You've got exposure with regards to credit risk, market risk, reputational, operational, compliance, liquidity, etc. It touches every single aspect of your organization's business. Next slide, please. So just to introduce our Encore tool, I'm not going to go into it in any detail due to time constraints, but you're welcome to look at those two links over there and to actually get access to the Encore platform. It's free. You've got to register. This is what the landing page looks like. So when you do access that encore.naturalcapital.finance, you will get to the landing page, which looks like this. Next slide, please. And in the next couple of slides, just in a nutshell, to show you how it works, is you've got sectors which have different production processes, ecosystem services, looking at natural capital assets, and then looking at the drivers of environmental change, which would influence your ability to have your production processes and your ecosystem services supply those functions to your organization. Next slide. Next slide, please. That's just showing it in a different format, but very much on the same basis as what I've indicated. Next slide. And then just puts it into a very succinct flow diagram, looking at a GICS industry, such as food products. It can be agricultural products, which would be a sub-industry, looking at a production process associated with the production of food, large-scale irrigated arable crops. And what's actually fundamental is to acknowledge and to see that the multitude of ecosystem services that are associated with that specific production process. So disruption in a lot of those. So what in Encore, when you go and explore the tool, you will also have an ability to see which of those ecosystem services are material to your production process and rank it accordingly, and then take informed financial decisions with regards to that. Next slide, please. Something that we're very excited about, and that's going to be launched in the course of next month, is the new Encore Biodiversity module. So we focus Encore to date specifically around natural capital, but obviously due to the immense global pressure and threat on biodiversity, UNEP has deemed it necessary, and the NCFA team has deemed it necessary to actually put in something very specific about that. So while you have the Encore platform, which looks at the visual links between the economy and nature, we're trying to drive the notion towards aligning your financial portfolios with international biodiversity goals and targets. And as you can see, there are two blocks. So if you go into the Encore module, which will be launched, the new biodiversity module, which will be launched, as I said, in the course of next month. You will have the ability to access this specific interface and then make your decision based on that. Next slide, please. And then just the biodiversity model itself, what you can expect. I'm not going to go into any detail about it, but definitely something which I'm sure that you'd be quite excited as I am to go and explore and to see how that can benefit your organization in ensuring that you drive alignment to these global targets, which Jessica's also alluded to earlier on. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. I'm going to leave it at that. Please do log on to our website. We've got a multitude of documentation, reports, and collateral that would assist you in your journey with regards to embedding natural capital and biodiversity into your organizations and ensuring that it manifests and you make the right decisions with regards to your portfolio alignments going forward. Thank you very much. Thanks, Jessica. I'm slightly over time. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Thomas. That's great. And there's just been case studies from Nedbank and Land Bank released as well. So those are fantastic resources. There's certainly a lot to get your head around on this topic. And, Thomas has laid out a lot on the risk side for banks. And as Thomas mentioned, the task force on climate-related financial disclosure, is encouraging many more climate-related disclosures coming out of banks. And increasingly, banks will also be able be encouraged and eventually potentially required to disclose on natural capital risks as well. So I think there's a lot to absorb, and it can be a very different way of thinking for the banking sector. But it is important to kind of get ahead of these changes that are happening worldwide. And I think that the most important slide that Thomas had put up was the one around the SDGs and how we have planetary boundaries in the world that we live in, and in order to achieve the SDGs, we have to fit within them somehow. So I think that was a great scoping on the risk side. And now we're going to turn a little bit more to the question of how do we make biodiversity bankable? So what are the opportunities for banks? And banks have so many opportunities in the biodiversity space. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of great examples already around Africa. We wanted to just bring, or the organizers wanted to bring a perspective from Latin America as well, just for a different example of what's possible. So Federico Sinistra is going to speak. He's the investment manager for the Eco Business Fund for Latin America and the Caribbean. So in the past 15 years, he's been working with financial institutions and real sector companies, ranging from agribusiness producers, small finance companies, to the largest commercial banks throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. His experience is really centered on structuring investments via debt and equity to address the changing needs of companies in the region as they compete in a changing market landscape. So Federico, I'll hand over to you to share your presentation.
Thank you, Jessica. And I think this is it was a great flow by having Thomas present ahead of myself, because I'm going to focus a bit more on making this bankable, how to translate this message through a financial intermediary, because that is a key concept that we need to address if we want to make these solutions scalable and if we want to have a lasting impact in the way the business is done, and in pursuing these environmental opportunities related to biodiversity. So I'm going to open up a little bit with a history about the Eco Business Fund, because I think it merits, or it speaks for itself. The Eco Business Fund started in 2015 in Latin America. It is one of the funds advised by Finance in Motion, an impact asset manager that initially started its operations in Europe, in the European neighborhood, and in 2015 decided to take a bold bet to finance outside of its home market and to bring in a much more interesting or much more related investment thesis to the market. And specifically, it is around finding ways to make sure that financial intermediaries can unlock the potential that we have as a society in terms of supporting and financing biodiversity. And the importance of financial intermediaries is that they are the only ones who have the outreach and the capacity to really reach the broader clients and potential stakeholders that can make a change. So what we've been doing at the Eco Business Fund, and the Eco Business Fund has now over $500 million of dollars in long-term loans that are all being done through financial intermediaries. And I want to give you a little bit of a flavor of how we've done this, how we've reached a program that is growing, and within only 6 years, we have been able to really put a lot of attention in terms of what are the opportunities, the bankable opportunities around biodiversity that are worth mentioning. And with that, I can perhaps leave some ideas for those participants. Next slide, please. Next. So the Eco Business Fund started in Latin America, as I said, and we have a joint reality with the African continent, and it is probably that we have a very high share of highly important ecosystems in the world, and we're also part of dynamics, of export dynamics to the entire world that have put pressure on these ecosystems. And the question was, or the idea that we had as a company is being able to make these two realities come together and really understand where we could make a change in terms of understanding that the economic dynamic and the export dynamic of the different countries needs to be supported, but it also needs to work well, and it also needs to position these countries so that they can continue producing at increasing levels without hurting their capacity to produce into the future. So it again goes back to Thomas's points that we need to be very mindful of the way that the businesses are operating to make sure that they can continue operating, that they can every day be better in terms of supporting these problems that we all see and that are no longer theoretical but are realistic, and how we can translate this into actionable items and actionable financing that is done through banks. So in Latin America, we have just as in Africa, some interesting ecosystems that we lay out there. But what I want to focus my presentation on is how to convey and how to translate this message through a intermediary, because at the end of the day, this is a message that will need to be transferred through an intermediary, which has the outreach, the capacity, and it has the potential to generate a business out of serving biodiversity conservation. Next slide, please. So the first problem we approached when we started going to financial intermediaries in the region with a biodiversity or a green focused specialized or dedicated financing was that they say, oh, great, this is going to be very helpful for energy. And the first thing that we said, no, we consciously decided to leave energy outside of our mandate, because we believe that there is enough financing going to the energy, renewable energy efficiency level. So we wanted to target on more focused areas where we could have a larger impact. And we decided to have 4 focus sectors, which were the agribusiness, the aquaculture, the forestry, and the sustainable tourism sectors. And all of these sectors are very intertwined with biodiversity conservation, and biodiversity conservation is critical, is central to attacking any of these 4 sectors. And the financing that we've provided is all focused on these 4 sectors and is predominantly through financial intermediaries. We have now started to also tackle or target corporates directly, and that is very interesting. But I want to focus my presentation on how to do this through banks, because that's where the bulk of our resources are today, and because we strongly believe that if we want to make a lasting change, we need to aggregate the financial intermediaries in this dialogue, and we need to have them see this as a profitable business, because that in itself is going to be what drives this to be a sustainable change in time. This is not, I mean, the approach we're taking is really around making this commercially viable. And in order to make it commercially viable for banks, we needed to simplify. A bank has very many opportunities. They can tackle shoe production, they can tackle food production, they can tackle very many aspects that are relevant, and so we need to give them the tools to really understand and be more efficient and be able to understand the dynamics underlying some of these core problems that we've been discussing. And for that, we have decided to schematically position our funding or the eligibility of our funding in two ways. One, which is borrower specific. And in the borrower specific area, which is the first one that I'm going to tackle, what we have done as a fund, and we have no affiliation to any of these certifications that you can see on the screen, but what we have done there is gone with a lot of detail and with a lot of care into the world of certifications and chosen a set of certifications that we believe are closely related to making biodiversity and better use of resources viable. And what certifications are, for those who may not be familiar with these are certain voluntary schemes that a given producer or a given manufacturer can adhere to, and in order to maintain these certifications, they have to have a minimum, which is in one part is independent verification. So a third party needs to come in and assess that this given a person or group or company is following certain criteria, and this needs to happen on an ongoing basis. So through the certification approach, what we have said as a company, and where we think there is a lot of potential, is we want to continue the flow of funding, and we want to make it easier for those producers in our region that are doing things better, that are ascribing to a more robust way of handling the ecosystem, reality ecosystem services of the natural resources, and we want to continue making funds available to them. And so what we have done in this way is we've taken a group of certifications. In the case of Latin America, it is more than 30 certifications. And what we do to make this bankable, to make this tangible for banks, is we focus on each country with each group of banks or financial intermediaries in understanding this set of certified companies in their country, and helping them see how they have done things differently, how they're doing things differently. And through that, I'm just going to give a quick example. There's one of our countries is very strong on banana production and banana exports. And the reality is, in our region, we are not there yet, so that we can, as Latin Americans, consume or have a price premium associated to that banana production. That just doesn't happen here. I'm sure it doesn't happen in Africa, but there are some markets who have already gone through different stages of development, and where consumers are actually very concerned about these dynamics and are willing to pay a price premium for a banana that is produced ascribing to a higher set of standards. And that is what we want to translate. But since that buyer is willing to set aside a little bit more of its income to make a change, what we want to do is put it all the way down to the producer, because what we've seen when we've analyzed these value chains is that a lot of the financing is staying in the intermediation, in parts of the value chain where there is a limited impact to make a change with regards to the environment. So what we've done through this certification scheme is try to take that premium that is paid by the consumer in a hard currency or in a developed market, all the way down to the end user, or the primary producer, or the primary manufacturer of that product, so that they can use that to enhance their relationship with the environment. So that is a very powerful approach. It's simple. The way we approach it is we sit with the bank and we say, listen, these are clients that hold an eligible label for us. There are more labels. These ones we understand very well, and we can tell you, for example, that a Rainforest Alliance banana producer in country X is, for one part, having the environmental permits required, having the water capture systems for their use of water as per local law. And this may be a kind of irrelevant themes, but you won't know how important it is, because the first thing that a banker in a region will say is, I think primary production is very risky because there is volatility, there is compliance risk, there is environmental and social risk. And so I shy away from that. But if we can give them a short fix, a proxy to say, we understand these dynamics, we understand these realities, but there are ways to use other knowledge that is building up to reduce these risks, or at least to have you be able to focus your attention on what is more relevant, then the certifications play a very important role. Because for a bank in country X that is targeting the banana production, having a Rainforest Alliance certified producer is very, very interesting, because it already allows them to be much more relax about some of these problems and some of these issues by relying on a third-party audit and a third-party certification. And what they have found, or what we have seen now, is that some of these partners that we have in the region are literally focusing their full origination for primary production alongside the certification value chains, and they've understood it, and they've opened up, and they've gone for different certifications. So this has become very important. We have about 75% of our funding going to certified companies, and these certified companies also include social aspects. There is the fair trade certification, which is very strong in the region, which also tackles a more balanced supply and value chain throughout some of these commodities. So we'll be happy to elaborate a bit more on that, but for time's sake, I'm going to move to our second approach, which is there are companies who are not yet certified, and the certification has cost associated to that, and there are investments that will take them closer to being certified, or not even being certified, but being able to have a better environmental performance, or having a lesser environmental footprint through their operation. So what we have done here is also focusing on investment activities, no longer the recipient of the funds, but rather the uses of the funds. And this is a little bit more tricky, because what we require here is that the banks have actually capacity to understand and to follow up on these. And so what we've seen is kind of a shift from, initially they follow a relatively straightforward approach that is easy to understand, and then they start seeing opportunities, and they start moving towards more of what we call the green list approach. And what to make it very simple, what we want to do here is for example, for one easy example is irrigation, and we're very interested in supporting irrigation that is more efficient. And some companies, in order to be certified, they have to have some performance in terms of the amount of water that they're using, with comparison to like-minded or similar projects or developments. And in order to be able to be up to par, they have to first have made some investments into different areas, and irrigation is one of them. And what we've done there is actually supported banks in understanding what are the better types of irrigations that can help our clients be more efficient, that can reduce the financing costs, the risk cost, and various other costs associated to the business, and made these clients creditworthy and more interesting, and reducing the credit risk associated to those. And finally, we have a third sector where we're looking at non-standardized measure, everything that is not in these two but has an environmental connection. We're also able to tackle it, and with this suite of relatively 3 products, we're able to make we have been able to grow our fund. Our fund is now very relevant to the company. It is almost a quarter of the funding that we have deployed is in these 4 sectors, and very concentrated more on the agribusiness and agri-processing sector. We've done quite a bit on aquaculture, which is a beautiful sector. There's a lot to be done, and our approach there has been very interesting, but it's more limited because it requires a certain reality. And in the forestry sector, we've done also quite a bit, but where we see a crispier or a nicer or a connection that is much more relatable to income, to job creation, to environmental enhancement, to balanced regional growth, is in the agribusiness space. And the first thing is that we look at this at the full value chain, and so we're not only looking at the primary producer, but we're also looking at the manufacturer or the transformation company, which is taking that primary production, which is done in a certain special way, and is being able to take forward that value and that concept, and tweaking it in a certain way to make it a product that, again, these are products that are being consumed in the developed markets. So let's not forget about the connection about exports and about being able to take this small producer in aggregating them itself or themselves into these value chains that at the end of the day are going to provide them a little bit of an extra income to be able to tackle the most pressing needs, which are very much going to be related around biodiversity and different opportunities around nature. So with that, I move to the last slide that I have, and then I leave some examples there of things that have worked well. I'll skip the impact pathway. Sorry for that. I mean, whoever is interested, we have a very much a lot of information on how we've done this impact mapping and how we've translated 500 million worth of subloans into actual tangible impacts, into less water use, into less herbicide use, into higher amount of hectares with certain qualifications or being handled in a certain way. So we translate all into that. That's going to be important. That is going to be key in the future for getting more people interested. But I want to use my last 2 minutes in giving some concrete examples in terms of the actual investments that we are seeing being very interesting in the region. And one of them is around cacao and coffee. There is production under agroforestry systems, both in the cacao and in the coffee value chains. There are different alternatives in how you can produce, but there is quite a bit around mixing the agroforestry, and this also applies to cattle, which is silvopastoral systems, which is literally mixing better, making it more conducive for these production landscapes to aggregate or to incorporate a biodiversity angle through maintaining a given set of afforestation, or through using a part of the production landscape to provide environmental services. And so here we've had a lot of impact in terms of coffee. We focused on certain countries that are very important for coffee production, and we've seen those that are producing coffee under agroforestry systems, shade-grown coffee basically. And we have been able to understand a lot of important environmental services associated to these productions, and we've focused our partners to be able to understand this and to also understand this from the commercial aspect. Those agroforestry systems around coffee allow for higher quality coffees that then also command a price premium, and then again can go all the way down to that producer who for them to make sensible decisions of how to engage with nature and how to take care of nature as part of their business. So that has been very, very interesting. We've done quite a bit around farmed aquaculture. We see a huge importance in being able to retain or to protect mangroves and mangrove environments. And what we've done there is helping producers to move upland to avoid producing in areas that can have a direct impact, and in supporting them in also understanding the importances of mangrove. And at the end of the day, what we've been able to do is focus the banks in order to be able to they themselves understand what is the difference between a given producer that is producing in a given way and one that is producing in a different way, and how they can correlate that to credit risk, and how they can build the origination associated to reducing credit risk by having clients that understand the importance of embedding nature within their operation. And for the sake of time, I'm going to stop there, and I'll be happy to take any questions on more specific ways of how you can tell this message to a banker, because he has limited time, but he has a very important role to play, and you need to use that limited time in making it very clear that it is both profitable, that it is credit sensible, and that it will open up huge opportunities that are more and more becoming the norm in the world, I would say. And with that, you will see three specific financings that we've done in the fund that can spark some ideas. And in our website, you can also find some other ones, and I'll be happy to take any questions. Thank you, Jessica.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Federico. That was really inspiring and also very tangible. And I think those 3 takeaway messages, being concise about profitability, credit sensitivity, and just the opportunities of changing norms are really important takeaways. So if we can, if anybody has any questions for Federico or Thomas, and we're coming to the 3rd presentation soon, please pop them in the Q&A box, and we'll come back to those at the Q&A session at the end. Now, Federico, you gave us so many great examples of how we make biodiversity bankable. And now we're going to turn to Marianne Haar she's the Executive Director of the Green Digital Finance Alliance. And Marianne is looking really into the future of how do we use digital finance in promoting biodiversity conservation, and how can we harness the trends in the fintech landscape for nature finance. And Marianne's going to give us a few use cases. So before leading the Green Digital Finance Alliance, Marianne was an advisor to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Denmark on digital finance in emerging markets. And she's also been leading the think tank Sustainia, working on technology for green finance. And Marianne's also worked quite a lot around West and Southern Africa. So Marianne, we're so glad to have you here. Please go ahead when you're ready.
Thank you so much, Jessica, and thank you all for the invitation. Yes, so what I'm going to share with you today, and I'm not going to take too much time, so we have time for the conversations, is really what are some of the pathways that FinTech offers if applied to biodiversity finance, really to help to address the existing barriers, such as high perceived risks that we also heard Federico talk about, and assets that are too small for capital. Biodiversity data, which is location specific rather than economic activity specific. Next slide, please. So I'm going to do that by drawing on some of our work where we have mapped out the global FinTech for biodiversity practices, but I'm going to share with you 3 main trends or 3 main pathways. It's data capabilities that FinTech brings for biodiversity footprinting and risk rating. The second is digital pathways for scaling biodiversity finance. I'm going to focus more on that. That's the opportunity pathway. And the third is really transaction data for maximization of nature and carbon exposed behavior. And then I want to leave you, of course, with some concrete steps that you can do if you're part of the banking community to also start on your own digital biodiversity finance journey. Next slide, please. So currently really where most banks are is that they are currently, but that's okay. So where most banks are currently at the stage of trying to understand their biodiversity exposure, right? And we also heard the Encore tool can help you on that, but there are really no fully automated There was another slide for this, but I can share that with you later, which sort of shows the footprinting tools. There are no fully automated biodiversity footprint tools on offer in the market, and for a very clear reason, because the data layer is simply missing. We have companies that tend to underreport on 150 databases that's been mapped out by UNWCMC that are not related to economic activities, but they have data sets that are related to locations, difficult to connect to a security and thereby to your financial decision making. So really, currently what we have in the market is that we have 6 overall metrics for biodiversity. They do not leverage digital technology in the sense that they do not harvest biodiversity risk behaviors of companies using IoT, etc. But these metrics mainly use existing databases on global trade flows, and then they ascribe a biodiversity pressure to the part of the trade flow that you're accountable to through your investments. So that's the current state of the market. Of course, we have new regulation, such as the taxonomy in the EU and the SFDR, which is currently shifting this towards more precise biodiversity footprinting. And now we get to the right slide that you see here, which is, I wanted to share with you the fact that we have the missing data layer. We don't have, as we heard from Jessica, biodiversity is geolocation specific. So therefore, we cannot only leverage company disclosed data, because that data layer is simply not good enough at the moment. We have to go out and use Earth observation data sets from sensors on ground, but also satellite imagery. And depending on what jurisdiction you are a bank in, the data layer or the Earth observation data layer will be quite significantly different in terms of what you can leverage in your financial practices, both for risk and opportunity. I have taken what you see on one side of the slide is from China. China has, because of the war against pollution, has the largest, one of the countries with the largest number of sensor harvested data in the world. So this has been leveraged by, this is a picture from the IPE platform led by Mr. Dr. Marjun. So what he does on his platform is that he tracks 5,000 companies 6 million companies every day. He uses 5,000 sources of emission data to convert that into a green credit score on a number of all these companies in the Chinese jurisdiction. And he sells that onwards to asset owners and asset managers in the country. But of course, when you are a banker on the African continent, the data availability for you to do this automation of inclusion of biodiversity risk metrics into your financial decision making is much, much thinner. So just what I've took on the slide is really what are the data sets if you do not have available these censored data sets locally, you can leverage today, and that is really mainly the open source data sets, which is from government satellite missions. You have the European Sentinel-2 data sets that you see here. You also have the Landsat from the US. And they give you data with 10 meters resolution. So you can actually geotag farmland boundaries. You can also determine farm diversification using this, and you can understand the environment that is around the farm. But the challenges with leveraging, if you are a bank, these satellite data sets is really the capabilities of analyzing them. So it's really the AI capabilities to really extract the relevant information for you. Next slide. So I guess, yeah, I don't know, something happened with the, unfortunately, with there was some text on these slides that has for some reason turned black, so you cannot read it. Turning from really looking at leveraging digital data for footprinting and risk assessment on biodiversity to really looking more at the opportunity pathways for scaling biodiversity finance. I have divided this slide, and that you can see, into opportunities at asset level and at financial instrument level. So we look if we look at the first sort of capability that fintech bring at the asset level, it's really automated identification of the most investable biodiversity positive or transition assets. Currently, there is an information asymmetry, and I think we also heard that in the previous presentation, between the real economy on biodiversity and banks. And here you can really deploy algorithms on satellite images to identify biodiversity, whether that is forest or whether that is organic and certified farming, as we just heard, that is most investable. And the most important capabilities that this gives you is that you can actually go back on these open source satellite repositories to essentially build a historic track record of those farmers and of those forestry assets. So you can put that into your models to see what are the return potential and what has that been over a number of years of these assets. The second is really that you can digitize biodiversity assets from the ground up as well, because if you only leverage satellite data, there will be quite a number of data gaps, because satellite data is not granular enough at the moment today, or it's too expensive if you need it too granular to really pick up what is the soil fertility, so what is the microbiodiversity, the flora and fauna in the farmland that you're investing in, which is extremely important for the credit risk, but also what is the pollinants, etc. You will not be able to capture that from satellites. So therefore, there you will need to, as a banker, go in and help your clients to help digitize some of that biodiversity data, which is basically can put into your credit risk models. So through infrared soil scanning, which is available in the market and farmers can use them themselves, they're fairly cheap. They can capture the organic matter in the soil and the soil structure. They can also, through soundscapes in their cell phones, capture what are the pollinants, what is the richness of biodiversity on their farm, which has a correlation to the potential to produce there. So you can build that into the credit scoring regime, and you can really get a whole sort of client photo from a biodiversity perspective. So the third capability is also the one that I think has most potential, because it will complement what we heard in the previous presentation by Federico, which is really around how to leverage fintech to make these assets even more bankable or better business. So once you have digitized the track record and included new data from the ground up, you can start to really look at, first of all, aggregating smaller assets, as we also heard of from Federico, and leverage digital to do that. But you can also really enhance and start to create new value streams by building up the biodiversity of these assets. Because currently the way we structure these types of green loans is through interest rate rebates, right? So you will basically link more and more biodiversity positive behaviors and reward that with an interest rate rebate. But what we also can do is what Rabobank is doing in the Netherlands. They have actually introduced a planet impact loan to farmers, which quantifies the biodiversity results of dairy farmers with the aim of developing new revenue models. So they measure on key performance indicators of the loan related to climate, land use, loss of minerals, soil, landscape, and species. And farmers who perform well on these, they get an interest rate rebate, but they also get ecosystem payments from the local authority. So if they have improved the water quality by lesser phosphate, etc., application on the soil, they actually get ecosystem payments. And in addition, and what is really interesting here, is that Rabobank has also launched with this a carbon bank. And this is to enable the dairy farmers to monetize the increase in the organic carbon from improving the soil organic matter, which results in them behaving according to the biodiversity linked loan. So this is really to enable the farmers over time, and Rabobank over time, to shift away from having to give biodiversity linked behaviors a lower interest rate to building it into actually new markets by offering these farmers to be part of voluntary carbon markets through monetization of soil carbon. And the last capability is really around asset forecasting. So if you both have the historical track record from using satellite images, you have the on the ground profile of your farmers' assets, the soil fertility, etc., you're in a much better position to do asset forecasting of how it will behave in terms of increased return over time and how your risk will be managed over time. And now if we look at the other side of the slide, which says financial instruments, what I will say there with the most important capabilities really that fintechs bring to this space is its ability to, in a cost-efficient way, structure through digitization smaller bonds or smaller financial instruments that corresponds better to the size of biodiversity assets. So if you tokenize a bond, we've modeled and calculated how much can you actually gain in efficiency, and it was a 10-fold efficiency gain from a sort of classical issuance to a fully digital issuance, but also that you can open up your biodiversity investment vehicles to crowd in new types of investors, for instance, retail investors, which we've seen in a number of jurisdictions. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this is what's mainly happening in Asia, and this is banks or fintechs with payment solutions that are starting to look at their transaction data, so your payment data through a green lens. So we work with the ant forest application in China. It has 7% of the world's citizens that actually get automated carbon footprint on 18 of their behaviors. So whether they take the bike or the car, they get a carbon footprint, and then they use algorithms to then monitor whether you are shifting to a more carbon light lifestyle. And if you are shifting to a more carbon light lifestyle, you will get rewarded with green energy points. And when you have accumulated enough energy points to then they will reward you with planting an actual tree. You can also, they've now started also to enable you to also get rewarded by protecting biodiversity. So you can plant a tree, or you can choose to protect an area for the biodiversity to be protected for a period of a year instead of planting a tree. And we saw this type of application launched in the Philippines last year by GCash, and it now has 6.9 million users after just a year and a half of operation. Currently, it's mainly for carbon, but what we want to incentivize these large mobile platforms also on the African continents, we're discussing that with MTN and Vodafone, is also to go in and look at their transaction data from a nature risk exposed behaviors perspective, and offer people to shift to more plastic lifestyle, to less e-waste, heavy lifestyles, etc. Next slide, please. So this is the last slide. And this is really the data you see on top of the slide is the deployment of different types of digital technologies by funds today. And there you can see that the Earth observation or the geolocation data sets, which are so important for both risk management and opportunity development within biodiversity finance, are the least leveraged, and they're also the least precise at the moment. So it's a space that will be evolving quite rapidly, and especially as a response to increased regulation over the next few years. So what can you do? Well, rather than starting sort of looking at your data assets across the entire bank to identify data sets with green capabilities, our proposal would really be instead to start with identifying a use case in biodiversity finance that you believe will drive value for you and your clients. And then really look at what are the data assets you have today, which you have maybe not leveraged from that perspective. Identify what is the data gap. How can do you need to go to satellite data? Is it the farmers themselves? You help to digitize part of their green asset data? Or do you get it through APIs working with other digital data sets in your jurisdiction? And then really use that to go into innovation, to a biodiversity, digital product design, and service development. This is the last slide. Thank you for your attention, and I'm looking very much forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Marianne. And you know, that it just points to the exciting future ahead. And one of the comments was we need to move with speed. And I think some of these fintech tools really help to do that. When you mentioned, you know, the opportunities to be rewarded by planting trees, you know, I was thinking about the livelihood opportunities, you know, the Kenyan Greenbelt movement and the Great Green Wall across the 11 countries across the Sahara and the Sahel, and thinking, you know, what future could we have harnessing these tools? So we don't have too much time for the discussion, but there's a kind of recurring question around biodiversity friendly investments. And I wonder, Federico, if we can call on you and just ask, you know, are you aware of any list or screening tool for biodiversity friendly investments? And, you know, maybe you could also comment on how do you measure biodiversity impact?
Great, Jessica. Thanks for the question. It's very interesting. The biodiversity compliant investments will depend specifically on what it is that certain investors want. So we do have a list. That's the list that we are pursuing, but we don't want to share this because we don't think it is exhaustive enough. The way we go about this, Jessica, is this is not a top-down issue. We cannot go and say to our partner banks that they need to finance A, B, and C. What we do is we go with them and we say, what are you financing, and what from those financings is subject to a better performance in terms of biodiversity? And we start building this bottom up. And so from our particular experience, and I just want to be very clear that we're just one stakeholder in this immense blue ocean, but we're making some inroads. And the way we've done it is we've literally sat together with each potential partner institution, and we've said to them, which are the most relevant sectors, because there are a lot of opportunities, but in order for this to be scalable, we want to see the areas where they are, because they know this already. They have assessed credit risk. They have gone and they've done quite a bit. And so the way we do this is we extract from them, from their businesses. So if a given bank is very focused on coffee and cacao, then we start presenting what for us it would be biodiversity sensible investments. What I can do is I can share a link where we've mapped this or we've grouped this ourselves into different themes, and then we'd be happy to follow on specific investments that may be more correlated. But one is very much tied to Marianne's prior presentation, which is the cattle space is very important in Latin America, and I'm sure in some parts of Africa. And before, satellite monitoring seemed to be something very far off. This is for NASA and for other people. Well, actually, in reality, it's no longer the case, because there are a lot of data sets, and Marianne pointed to a couple, but there are other ones. There is one company which is also supported by United Nations, which is the Global Forest Watch Initiative. And what they've done is they've taken these data sets and they've made it publicly available to all. And I'll put in the chat box for anybody who's interested. And what this tool does is it allows any user to use satellite data to see changes in forest landscape. And that literally is deforestation. And when you're approaching a sector such as the cattle sector, and you're concerned about the potential impact that your clients may be having on deforestation, you may want to see in the map how their performance is doing, and you may want to segment this into those who have been able to do things in a certain way versus other ones who have done them differently. And at the end, this should be embedded in your credit decision, because a client that is doing sensible, environmentally sound practices is going to be a better client. It is already a better client, and you should be providing better financing services to them versus the other. And in that way, kind of making the allocation of resources commercially tied to this and exploit from that, Jessica. So I'll be happy to, I'm going to put this on the chat box now, and I'll be happy to follow on with any specific questions around given sectors, which is where we've been more effective, tying this biodiversity to cacao, to shrimp production, to banana production, to rice production. And there it's different, because the investments that have an impact in biodiversity in rice are very different than those with cacao. So I just don't want to venture in proposing a list that may not completely capture all the opportunities that there are out there.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Federico. And I think we can squeeze in one more question. So Marianne, I hope I can call on you on this topic. I think it was very good that you mentioned rangelands, and we also had Marianne mentioned soil sequestration, and forests and mangroves have come up as well. And I think what's exciting here is biodiversity has multiple benefits, and managing biodiversity well means that ecosystems can better sequester carbon, and that unlocks opportunities in the global carbon market that presents new financing sources, new sources of revenue, to the African continent. I wonder, Marianne, if you would like to say anything around the benefits from the carbon market linked to green digital finance, and noting we only have a few quick moments left before we need to wrap up.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what we need to build into the biodiversity assets, as you also say, and what we discussed before, so that we can move out of the situation that biodiversity is something that needs a rebate if you finance it, to rather this is something that can enhance the asset. And at one point in time, we would be able to go to 0 interest rates, right? Because you would be able to then monetize either the soil carbon or the carbon sequestered from the trees on your farm when you're doing more diversified intercropping, for instance. So I think that's the regime we need to do more experimentation with now. We've really proved the biodiversity or nature-linked bonds and the SDG-linked bonds. Now we need to move exactly into enhancing the assets, so we can have 0 interest rate biodiversity type instruments out there to really scale, like we talked about with speed, right?
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. That's a perfectly succinct response. And this has been such an interesting session for me. I hope for others as well. The 90 minutes just flew by. So I'll hand over to Hughes, who will close us out and thank the panelists. Thank you very much.
Okay. No, thank you very much, Jessica. Thank you really for moderating these very enlightening sessions. what I would say that it's quite challenging to do justice to such a topic in 1 hour and a half, but clearly we have been exposed to the various facets of this concept of biodiversity and the connection with the bank and financial sector broadly. In terms of key messages, we could say that I took away that biodiversity is localized. It can be used as or considered as an asset in development finance. We could also say when you are speaking to the bank, be very straightforward and really think about profitability, credit sensitivity, and the opportunity that can be generated from biodiversity. It will make your conversations easier. And finally, I understood that we need, in the process of moving the speed, fintechs have a role to play in accelerating the current trend. Clearly, the financial sector has an important role to play in the preservation of the world biodiversity and ecosystem, and there is a strong case to mobilize the financial sector in Africa around this global agenda. Making Finance Work for Africa will like to take a more proactive approach in promoting sustainability broadly in the financial sector through our key instruments that are advocacy, knowledge disseminations, and policy dialogue. In this respect, we are really eager to forge fruitful partnerships, and we hope to have follow-up conversations with our partner after we conclude this webinar. On this, I would like to reiterate our thanks to our excellent speakers of today, starting with our moderator, Jessica, for the good managed, Jessica Smith, I should pronounce the full name, for the excellent moderations of this session, the good management of time, and for the discussion that has followed. They were very enriching, enlightening, and on that also, I would like to thank our presenter, the presenter, Thomas Van Vegens, Federico, I will not go to maybe over, and Marianne for their insight. They share a lot with the audience. Special thanks also to Eric Wayama, John Cage, for helping to put together these excellent programs and panel. We extend our gratitude to your institutions as well for all the work that you have been doing in this space, and we really hope that we will leverage our respective strength for the future. For this webinar, we had more than 280 registered participants. At the end of the day, we had more than 100 attendees, which is quite significant. Amongst them, we have representatives of commercial banks, development banks, central banks, and also academics. Also, the development partner, development community. This is a good testimony to the interest of the topic to our audience. And I would like to thank the attendee for making the time to join these webinars and for being so proactive. We appreciate your comments and questions and hope that the feedback you receive met your expectation. We will see how to address some of the pending questions and share the response with you afterwards. Finally, please be aware that the recording of this webinar and the presentation will be made available to you after we wind up these sessions, and probably I will say within 72 hour maximum, which is 3 days. We will on this also request your cooperations in filling in the survey that will pop up when you close, you leave the sessions. It will appear on your screen, and please just fill in. That helps us to improve the quality of our webinar going forward. Do enjoy the rest of your day. We are very pleased to have you all. Bye-bye, and see you next time. Thank you very much.